Necrotic, while not being the worst of fix, is definitely not a favorable one among the tank player base. High necrotic stacks can easily make some mechanics or even light damage extremely deadly if not countered. This affix has seen many nerfs over the seasons, and in its current iteration, it's a 6-second physical debuff that is applied from melee attacks, and then each stack is going to reduce your incoming healing by 2%, and of course, new stacks will refresh this duration. So in this video, I just want to go over some helpful tips that I've come across for the tank player base over the last few years, and more specifically Guardian Druids. So I'm going to briefly mention other tanks throughout the video, and there's going to be timestamps below, so feel free to jump around. A quick disclaimer though, I do want to address the elephant in the room. Most players look at this as a tank problem, but it is far from that. DPS players and healers alike should be paying attention to the tank stacks or how they are moving and positioning. If you see a tank kiting, you're going to want to help out. This week, players will want to hold any type of CC or slows until the tank is retreating or kiting, and with that out of the way, let's just jump into the video. Alright, so first things first, you're probably going to want to get a Necrotic Weakaura. You, as a tank player, should want to track your stacks. This is important because sometimes tracking just the physical debuff on your actual character can kind of be hard to see and overwhelming at times. So there's tons on Wago. I'll also have this Weakaura that I have linked in the description below. You can also find it in my Discord as well. I'll post it there. But this will display how many stacks you have and the percent of the healing reduction. You'll probably see it in clips throughout this video. So just, it's really good to be mindful of what it looks like, so you know when you need to start kiting. Another thing that I have found is that, of course, with a healing reduction means that there are some abilities and trinkets that aren't going to be as strong later in the pull that you typically would save, that would typically save your life. So things like Blood Splattered Scale or Shard of Van Hild. And then there's, of course, other trinkets as well. You want to be aggressive with these. You want to use them on pull or as early in as possible before your stacks get too high to maximize the value. If you have 40 stacks of Necrotic and an 80% healing reduction, Scale is not going to save your life. If anything, it's going to help you mitigate maybe one auto or half a cast. So be aggressive with your tanking trinkets early on. There are a lot of tanks as well that have a great toolkit for helping kite mobs. Now, of course, as a Guardian Druid, we have access to Balance Affinity or Resto Affinity. Typhoon is typically going to be the play that most Guardian Druids are going to be used to, so I'll talk about that. It's a little bit easier to use, especially in conjunction with Mass Entanglement. What you can do is simply Typhoon most of the mobs back. You want to put yourself in a good position to do so, so every mob is getting knocked away. You want to knock mobs away into a safe location, start moving the direct opposite way, so 180 degrees, and then make sure you're throwing out a mass root. This will typically buy you enough time to drop necrotic stacks. Now, of course, there are some pulls that you have to be careful on. Any leaper mobs will refresh the stacks if they jump to you. So this might be seen in things like Necrotic Wake or Gambit. Now, with that being said, you want to make sure you're saving your any kind of crowd control for kiting and not just for like throwing it out for fun or throwing it out to interrupt a cast. Thinking about this, a monk comes to mind. You want to save leg sweep for when you need to kite. Or if you have a windwalker in your group, for example, or a hunter, you want to make sure you're saving things like leg sweep and binding shot for when the tank needs to drop stacks. If you run with any of those classes, make sure you're discussing which CC you guys have available to help the tank kite. Something else I want to discuss is that there are specific mobs that you can't actually kite. And when you're planning your route or you're thinking through the dungeon you're about to go through, you need to keep in mind which mobs can and cannot be kited. So a great example of this is a Necrotic Wake. At the very end of the dungeon, when you're dealing with some of these larger stitchwork type mobs, these guys can't be kited. So you either need to figure out a way to have a pet taunt or a blessing of protection, or planning your route in such a way that you can actually create enough space between you and the mob to drop necrotic stacks. What I personally do is I wait for him to cast a specific spell. So for Gore Grind, it's the Gut Slice, and for Rot Spew, it's his Spew Disease. You can create a good amount of distance during this 2 second or like 1.5 second cast, but you have to know when to start moving with it. I don't want to make this video too long, so I'm not going to go through these specific scenarios, but if you are doing this dungeon, I would recommend constantly be moving, and as soon as you see like a Spew Disease, just start booking it. You can do this with Dash, you can do this with Stampeding Roar, You can drop it in other ways with Kyrian File or Pet Taunt, but make sure you have something planned out for these mobs, especially on a fortified week. Another dungeon I want to quickly point out, because I will probably make this mistake as well, is if we come over to a new DOS route, if you're ever pulling any matriarchs, these mobs can also not be kited. So you want to make sure you're focusing these mobs as a group, but if you're pulling these, just be extremely, extremely careful of your necrotic stacks. Now, every dungeon is going to have a specific mob that can't be kited. I'm not going to go through all of them. Just be mindful. If you have a question about that stuff, you can always hit me up on my Discord. Being a Kyrian tank is also extremely overpowered. The Kyrian file allows you to actually remove the stacks of necrotic and a 3-minute cooldown. Now, you want to be careful with this because you need combat to drop before the cooldown will actually start. So you want to make sure you're using it towards an end of a pull, or if you do use your file, making sure that combat fully drops before you chain into another pull. Now, I've seen a lot of controversy or a lot of discussion about which one you should tank. So most tanks who play Kyrian are going to be running Mechanicos, Mr. Big P, Brawn. I've seen arguments for either taking your charged additive or your Forge Light filter. Now, most players will play the Forge Light filter because of the extra potency, but this might be a good week to go for the charged additive. So the reason why you would do this is because the Forge Light filter, if you're taking the potency conduit, will actually automatically consume the charge when you reach a low point. Now, some players really like this because they don't have to think about their file use, they don't have to really think about their stacks, they just know that if their necrotic stacks are too high and they dip low, they're good. They don't have to really worry about it. Now, the argument and the problem that I have found playing higher keys, so when you were 20 or higher, even up to like 24s and 25s that I've been playing in, sometimes you take a big enough hit that you drop below 35% health and you don't want this to be used, but you can't tell the game that. It's going to automatically use it as basically upon reaching sub 35% health, as long as you're not dead, it's going to instantly remove your file and it's going to use it. Now, the problem with that is, like I said, in higher keys, oftentimes that happens at the start of a pull or very early on. So you can sometimes run into the situation where it uses the charge without you wanting to, and then necrotic becomes an issue. So running the extra endurance conduit and then allowing it to also knock enemies away from you is extremely, extremely strong. Now, again, there are some tanks who either don't play Kyrian or they don't play Brawn, they don't play Mechanicos, but most tanks do. So if you are playing it, I would recommend playing the charge additive this week, unless you're very, very, very comfortable with knowing that you're not going to dip below 35% health. But I can promise you most tanks doing higher keys will find themselves dipping that low more often than not, despite it being necrotic weak or not. I will also say this, I don't think necrotic is necessarily worth leveling if you're not already like 80 renown just for this week. Now, of course, it helps if you're really, really having problems. It's an extra way to deal with necrotic, but most tanks have a way to slow mobs or stun them or keep them away long enough for it not to matter. You have things like concentration slows, you have movement speed, roll, ring of peace, typhoons. Most tanks have a very, very good way to kite, especially if their groups decide to actually help out. So if you're a player who's like, let's just say you're on your bear and you're thinking about maybe leveling Kyrian for the first time, Ravenous Frenzy specifically is so overpowered when it comes to being a really, really good damage cooldown, as well as basically an immunity from damage for 30 seconds to 40 seconds, that it's not necessarily worth losing that just to go Kyrian. The last thing I do want to mention while I'm on the Paladin is that Necrotic in conjunction with the Spiteful Affix, which is the affix that's going on this week, is really, 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 really strong for certain tanks. So Kyrian, or I should say Paladin in general, have a talent called First Avenger, which your Avenger shield will actually give you a damage absorption for the damage it does, which is awesome. This damage, the way it's coded, ignores necrotic, because necrotic affects the healing multiplier for a lot of spells, actually for all spells. But First Avenger and Ursoc's Fury Remembered, which is the Guardian Druid legendary, ignore this mechanic because it's not a healing multiplier, it's a damage multiplier. So it actually gets around the necrotic affix. So Spiteful means that despite you being at a couple higher stacks, you're always going to have targets to hit, and those targets are more often not targeting you, of course, unless someone dies to the Spiteful mob, they might turn and fixate you. But As long as your group's being smart with their Spiteful, you can actually get more healing this week out of First Avenger. So don't be scared of Spiteful. The Guardian Druid Legendary works the exact same way. So when you're thrashed, that's why you see Guardian Druids be able to go up to like 99 stacks of Necrotic while in Incarn and not even take damage, is because they're just doing more damage than they're taking. So with all of that out of the way, those are all the tips that I have. If you have any other tips that I might have missed, or any specific tips that how you deal with Necrotic, leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear them, but I'm sure some other tanks would also appreciate it, knowing how a Blood DK or a Monk or a Prot Warrior, if there's any of you out there, how you deal with Necrotic. So thanks so much for watching. Hopefully this video wasn't too long, and hopefully it's not coming out too late. I'm trying to get it done earlier in the week rather than later in the week. So hope you guys learned something. Good luck in your keys, and I will catch you all in the next one. Take care.